Certain and Uncertain. Chapter 21. Asunder. Jen was not having a good morning. Being chased through the city by a nut job on a souped-up hoverboard with a literal axe to grind was not how she liked her Saturdays. She hadn't had a chance to call anyone for backup, not before the Omnitrix timed out and the alien swung the axe. There was a blast of light, and Jen blinked, sitting up. The sky was red, and she was laying on something very uncomfortable. Rocks. She blinked. Okay. How did I get here? She shook herself as she stood. Everything feels fine. She went to brush off her sleeve and froze, stock still. Her hand was gone. Her arm ending in a glowing red stump a few inches from where the Omnitrix should have been. She shook her head. No. Her voice was shaking as she waved her good hand through where her missing one should have been. She trembled as her knees gave out on her. She couldn't breathe. This couldn't be happening. She had no more time to panic, though, as a roar sounded feet away from her. She had just enough time to roll out of the way as a large green beast barreled past her. She took to her feet and ran, letting panic fuel her speed as she skidded down into a crevasse and out of sight of the creature. She shoved her good hand over her mouth and held her breath as it scuttled over her and out of sight. She waited, sinking to the bottom of the crevasse and breathing lightly through her tremors. Okay, I can still feel my hand. It's just not there. Not there right now. I can figure that out later. Right now I need to get out of here. Wherever here is. She pulled herself back to her feet and scrambled along the crevasse. Sunder laughed loudly. He opened the storage compartment on his hover glider. He tossed in the human hand still attached to the Omnitrix, a grin still on his face. Easy money, and the fortune at that. He laughed again, before a spike blossomed from the engine of his hover glider. No! The machine sputtered to a halt and fell to the asphalt. He swore and swung his axe, splitting the next spike in two. Stand down, appendages in the air. Appendages on your head and drop the axe. Plumbers are here. Pierce Wheels called out, holding out his plumber badge with one hand and readying another spike with the other. He'd been monitoring police radios and overheard something about a confrontation between a large blue monkey and a giant gray man with an axe. Here was the Axeman, but where was Spider Monkey? He frowned, but had no time to contemplate as he dove to the side, rolling to avoid the axe. He shot a volley of spikes, separating them for a moment as a green glow caught his eyes. He frowned. It was coming from inside the damaged hover glider. He jimmied the compartment open and stared for a moment before turning to glare at the gray man who was pulling the spikes out of his shoes. What did you do to her? The man laughed. Don't know, don't care. I am Sunder the Retriever. The Omnitrix is mine now, and I won't let some child plumber take my best payday in years from me. Pierce slipped his badge back into his belt and pulled a few pellets from a pouch there as Sunder charged. He threw them, and a cloud of smoke billowed, sending Sunder coughing and stumbling. When the smoke cleared, Pierce was gone. Sunder shook his head. Coward. He set to work on his hover glider. This is officially the weirdest thing I've ever done, Pierce said, looking over at the passenger seat of his truck. It was technically a loaner from Ed, but he drove it everywhere. The passenger seat was currently occupied by a severed hand, which somehow wasn't as gross as it sounded. There was no blood or gore. Rather, where the wrist should have been attached to the rest of Jennifer Tennyson, it simply glowed bright red. But that wasn't the end of the glow. The watch was moving on its own, the dial turning and twisting, and slowly green lines of code were spreading out from the watch over the pale skin. He flinched as the fingers on the hand twitched. Just drive, Pierce. Max may be out of town, but Gwen and Kevin might know what to do. Okay, so null void, that's helpful. Well, I say helpful. Jen muttered as she leapt from floating stone to stone. She'd ended up close to Animo's stronghold as devoid. It was busted up now. Clearly either time didn't work the same way here as it did everywhere else, or else things fell into disrepair rather easily. She was betting on the second. She'd have to ask Kevin, assuming she ever made it back. Her currently absent hand itched and felt too warm, but there was nothing she could do about it right now. She took a deep breath and hopped the last length, nearly missing and just catching the wall of the broken fortress, with her hand, her empty stump slapping uselessly next to it. She swore as she tried to make a fist. It felt like she succeeded, but she couldn't tell if that was true or not. She took a steadying breath. Get out of the null void first, then get your hand back. It had become a small mantra over the past, well, she had no idea how long she'd been here. Could have been hours, could have been days. Get out of the void, then get your hand back, then shove Sunder's axe up his ass. She nodded, liking the sound of that plan. She made her way into the destroyed fortress. Gwen smiled as Kevin pecked her on the cheek. She'd brought him lunch. Well, him and Ethan. They were having guy time, which meant Kevin was working on his car and Ethan was working on his bike. Ethan rolled his eyes and picked up his wrench, but set it back down as the sound of skidding tires met his ears. Guys. They turned, and Gwen's hands lit up pink as one of Ed's trucks came barreling around the corner, pulling to a stop just outside the warehouse. Pierce rolled down the window. You guys are not gonna be happy. His grim expression was nothing next to what he picked up out of the passenger seat. Gwen's stomach dropped through the floor, seeming to disappear entirely. What's that? She managed to stutter out at the sight of her cousin's hand, just her hand, in Pierce's. Then it moved, and she blinked. It was tapping the way Jen did when she couldn't visibly fiddle with the Omnitrix, which was whirring almost nervously. Max is out of town, talking to his old friend Wes about the tapestries at the dig site Jen accidentally flooded. Didn't know where else to go. Kevin nodded. Toss her here. That looks familiar. Pierce glanced at him, but nodded and tossed the severed hand to Kevin. It balled into a fist and punched him in the jaw as it wiggled, and he missed. Ow! Jen cried out as her missing hand throbbed. Why does it feel like I just punched a rock? She grumbled to herself as she dug through one of the few still standing storerooms. There wasn't much left here, but there had to be something she could use to at least defend herself on the way to Grandpa Max's old hideout. She spotted it beneath a few pieces of rubble and managed to shoulder them out of the way. She grinned as she recognized one of Manny's smaller blasters. Thank you, gun-happy Manny, she said to the void as she picked up the gun and tucked it into her belt. The screech met her ears seconds too late to redraw the weapon and stop the Null Guardian from grabbing her and taking off. Well, at least we seem to be flying the right way, she lamented, dangling upside down from a few of the beast's tentacles, her arms pinned to her sides. Chapter 22. Displaced. Ethan was feeling a little nauseous. His girlfriend's hand was sitting on the table in front of Kevin, severed from the rest of her, which was nowhere to be seen. Her fingers were twitching as the green code spread slowly. He circled the table. So, what are we looking at? He asked as he reached forward and gently poked the hand. It turned to him as if looking for the culprit. World's most disturbing Addams Family costume, Pierce suggested. Kevin snorted and shook his head. Nah, interdimensional displacement. It's not too uncommon, actually. I did it once with a malfunctioning warp belt trying to get out of the null void. Ended up with my nose in another dimension for 3 days. They were silent for a moment. Aren't you gonna ask me how I smelled? Terrible! Gwen glared. Just like your joke. Can you fix her? Kevin nodded. Yeah, I should have everything I need to rig up a retrieval beam. He began to dig through the boxes in his warehouse. It might take some time, though. An hour, maybe more. A hum filled the air. Don't think we have an hour, Pierce cried out as he dove to the ground, narrowly avoiding the axe aimed at him. I will have my prize, Sunder screamed, looking like he had gotten about halfway back home before he'd even realized that Pierce had taken Jen's hand when he'd escaped. Kevin shook his head. Buy me the time you can, he called out to the other three. They nodded. Ethan pulled a gun from one of the crates. The kickback on that's pretty harsh, he warned. I can handle it. Ethan leveled the weapon. Gwen, hit the deck. She dove to the ground and he fired. The kickback did knock him on his ass, but it also sent Sunder flying. Kevin shook his head.
I hope Jen's having a better time wherever she is,
he muttered as he began to rig the machine together. Fucking havoc beasts and their pointy little teeth! Jen swore as she fired again. Last time she'd had to take down a havoc beast, it had been tiny, and there had been one. In their native dimension, they grew slightly bigger, just as dangerous and very hungry. She fired around the corner, bringing the roof of what had been Max's house down. She shook her head. I hate the null void. Note to self. Get Kevin a really nice gift for ditching him here so long. She fired at the stray havoc beasts. Maybe a really nice gun. He likes guns. I'll have to ask Gwen. She knows her boyfriend. And I'm talking to myself. She sighed as she shook her head. Watch the car! Kevin called out as he fixed the final piece into the machine. He turned as Ethan and Pierce continued their game of keep away with Jen's hand. Got it! Sunder roared and lunged, but missed as Gwen caught her cousin's hand on a slide of mana and snagged it, tossing it to Kevin. Get my cousin back! She called out, slamming into Sunder. Out of the now mostly destroyed warehouse. He landed with a resounding crash and did not get back up. Kevin tossed the hand to the ground where it twitched. It was now covered in green code. He aimed his new device. Jen scrubbed at her arm. She rolled back her sleeve when it started itching. There were green lines of code coming up from where the Omnitrix was supposed to be. She grumbled. So you're there. That's good. Not really helping me right now in getting me out of here, but good to know. The lines of code grew warm, as though the Omnitrix were responding, but that actually wouldn't be too far out of what Azimuth had said might be possible. The Omnitrix was alive, after all. In a way. She frowned and closed her eyes. She could feel her wrist as if it were still attached to her. I need an alien to get me out of here, but I have no idea which one that would be. She sighed and passed her hand through the space the Omnitrix should have been in. There was a bright blast of light. She flinched. When she opened her eyes, there was sunlight again, and she was rapidly surrounded by familiar faces. She breathed out, but swore colorfully when she looked down at her hand. Why? Every time! It can't ever be simple! She grouched as Ethan glanced down at the stub of her arm. Well, at least we have you back, he offered. She rolled her eyes and returned his hug with one arm. Her eyes widened, and she tackled him fully to the ground, just barely missing the axe. Sunder! She shouted and pulled the sidearm she'd taken from Devoid's wrecked headquarters. She fired twice, sending the axe spinning to the ground. She aimed again. Give it up! You're not getting the Omnitrix! Kevin stepped in front of her.
Because it's not here. Use your little scanner. It's gone.
Sunder paused and pulled out his scanner. How do we get your hand back? Pierce asked. Jen shrugged, but a thought popped into her head. The axe did this. The axe should be able to fix it. Slipping the axe off Sunder while Kevin had him distracted was easy for Gwen. Less so when the green code lines appeared again and the Omnitrix began to register again. Could use an alien assist right now, Jen griped as she dove behind a wall to avoid a swing from Sunder's axe. Please make a selection. The voice echoed in her head, and it was like the images of her aliens were being superimposed over her vision in one eye. The eye on the same side she wore the Omnitrix. How to select was a different matter entirely. As it turned out, slightly shaking her head acted as though she spun the dial, and she grinned. This one sounds good, she said and winked. The green lights flashed, and suddenly Echo was there, spawning duplicate one-armed tiny aliens. Wall of sound! She shrieked, and as she surrounded Sunder. He dropped, unconscious and bleeding from one ear. Echo hit the Omnitrix symbol and transformed back into Jen. She grinned, one eye nearly flooded green. It looked as though the Omnitrix symbol, normally around her wrist, was now inside her eye. How are you doing that? Jen shrugged. No idea. It's like the Omnitrix knows I can't access the actual physical device right now, so it's connecting us in my brain. Neat, huh? Ethan stared at his girlfriend's eye as Pierce nodded. That's... Wow. How do we get your hand back? He asked. Kevin took the axe from Gwen.
We'll need the machine I used to bring her back initially, too.
Pierce elected to hold that. Ethan stood back slightly as Kevin aimed the axe. "Will you just swing the damn thing already?" Gwen asked, her voice not really shaking, but sounding nervous all the same. They all looked over at the spot where they'd left Sunder as he groaned and got back to his feet. Gwen snatched the axe from her boyfriend and swung it at her cousin's severed wrist. The light show was impressive, and when it was over, Jen cheered, clapping both hands together. The circuit lines vanished, and the hourglass in her eye righted back to her normal pupil and iris. Ethan sighed in relief and hugged her.
Good to have you back,
he said, and she nodded, threading their fingers together. Then she looked around. What happened to Sunder, though? She was right. The tech hunter was gone. Kevin shrugged as Gwen handed the axe back to him.
Probably ended up wherever you were.
Jen laughed. Hope he enjoys his trip to the Null Void as much as I didn't. Now, I need a shower and a med kit. Havoc be spite. Kevin laughed as Ethan began to fuss.